7 years of strife, violence, and bitterness climaxed in a simple outdoor ceremony at UN headquarters. Algeria joins the United Nations, and U Thant himself raises the green and white flag to its masthead, where it flies today with its 108 companions, all members of the United Nations. This is Don Pringle bringing you this week's edition of United Nations Review. In this fourth week of the General Assembly, several controversial issues dominated the scene. Questions like nuclear testing, Cuba, Algeria, colonialism, all came to the forefront at UN headquarters this week. 3 distinguished leaders from Africa and Latin America addressed the Assembly. The admission of Algeria to the United Nations lowered the curtain on a drama in which all member states had played some part. For 7 successive years, an agenda item called the Question of Algeria had appeared on the order papers of the United Nations General Assembly. The culminating chapter of the story was played out on Monday, and with a historic touch, it was France who sponsored the entry of Algeria into the United Nations. And it was a man who until recently had been a fierce adversary of France who came next to the rostrum, Ahmed Ben Bella, Prime Minister of Algeria.
Monsieur le Président, notre victoire.
Our victory, which is ours by right, is also the victory of the United Nations. A war is finished. A fire which had engulfed a whole people is now at last put out. The community of nations, enriched by a new partner, has the right to consider the end of this drama as a strengthening of peace in the world. This conflict, which had pitted Algeria against an age-long colonial domination, presented itself to universal conscience as the most expressive and most extreme manifestation of the great movement of emancipation, which following the Second World War spread through the dominated countries. The form of struggle that was imposed upon our country expressed in all its authenticity the legitimate aspiration which the developments of our time made inevitable.
The Algerian question, as the UN has known it for years, is settled. But a much more active international issue concerns Cuba, and it came up during the general debate. President Dorticos of Cuba, addressing the Assembly as head of state, accused the United States of pursuing a policy of diplomatic, economic, and military aggression against his country. The Cuban president said that the American attitude dated from the time that the Fidel Castro regime instituted certain reforms which affected U.S. financial interests. The speech of Mr. Dorticos was interrupted several times by demonstrations in the public gallery.
De estancia en este país, víctima de constantes preocupaciones, y esto ofrece las pruebas junto a ello declaraciones.
We sincerely hope that the government of the United States will make no new mistake. If it learned no lesson from Playa Girón, let it at least pause in its haughty march and listen to the loud voice of international wisdom. But if such an error is again made, then despite ourselves and against our wishes, we warn the United Nations organization right now of our determination to fight. If they make the mistake, we give warning that the aggression against Cuba, despite ourselves and against our every desire, can become transformed, as has been pointed out here, into the start of a new world war.
Dr. Dorticos declared that Cuba was not a bone of contention between East and West. What was involved here was the right of a country to follow the path it desired. He called on the United Nations to condemn the U.S. blockade of Cuba, but he indicated that the door was open for negotiation between the two countries.
Yo emplazo desde esta tribuna algunos de esos.
From the beginning of the deterioration in Cuban-United States relations, Cuba has constantly been ready to negotiate through normal diplomatic channels or by any other adequate means, but to negotiate the differences between the United States and Cuba. Our eagerness for a negotiated, peaceful settlement was published many times. It was included in official notes sent to the United States government. Our purpose and our willingness to negotiate were clearly stated. The repeated refusals of the United States government to negotiate proved conclusively that it had one single aim, namely, the overthrow of the revolutionary government of my country, the destruction of the Cuban Revolution, and interference in the exercise of self-determination by our people.
President, I have asked to speak to
Immediately after the Cuban speech, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson took the floor to protest. He stated that in observance of UN traditions, he would not reply to the Cuban president in the General Assembly. But later that same day, he held a press conference.
The government of the United States, like the governments of the other independent American republics, will honor its commitments to the United Nations Charter and to the inter-American system. As we have said so often, the United States will not commit aggression against Cuba. But let it be equally clear that the United States will not tolerate aggression against any part of this hemisphere. The United States will exercise the right of individual and collective defense, a right expressly recognized in the Charter against aggression in this hemisphere.
Mr. Stevenson's statement to the press took up the Cuban president's proposal for negotiations. The United States delegate believed that much wider issues were at stake than simply the temperature of U.S.-Cuban relations.
The president of Cuba professes that Cuba has always been willing to hold discussions with the United States to improve relations and to reduce tensions. But what he really wishes us to do is to place the seal of approval on the existence of a communist regime in the Western Hemisphere. But the maintenance of communism in the Americas is not negotiable. Therefore, the problem of Cuba is not a simple problem of United States-Cuban relations. It is a collective problem for all of the states of this hemisphere. If the Cuban regime is sincere in its request for negotiations and wishes to lay its grievances, real or fancied, before the appropriate forum, the Organization of American States, I would suggest that the Cuban government might start by some action calculated to awaken the confidence of the inter-American system. The obvious place to begin would be the severing of its multiple ties to the Soviet bloc.
The subject of colonialism was one of the major topics in the Assembly's continuing policy debate, and many speakers noted the role that the United Nations has played in helping to put an end to colonialism. But other speakers, particularly from newly independent countries, stressed that in many areas of the world, people were still denied the right to self-determination, the right of peoples to select their own government. One country, which in this past month has received both independence and admission to the United Nations, is Jamaica, whose representative, Hugh Shearer, called attention to the necessity for adequate preparation by the colonial powers of those newly emerging states.
There is one aspect of the emancipation process to which I wish to call special attention. I cannot join in praising those colonial powers who have for generations monopolized the seats of authority in their dependent countries, denying the peoples of these territories even a rudimentary experience in the art of managing a country's affairs, and who, with a great show of enlightenment, suddenly relinquish their political hold with little concern that the people are unprepared for stable and efficient self-government. I do not advocate, Mr. President, that the process of ending colonialism in the still dependent countries should be delayed by even one single day. Rather, I urge that the process of preparing the people of these countries for stable and efficient self-government should be resolutely and systematically pressed forward.
And President Sekou Touré of Guinea presented his country's position on colonialism this week. He hailed Algeria's coming to independence as a heroic achievement, and he urged the unity of all African peoples. The Guinean president said that the continuance of colonialism in such places as Angola and Rhodesia was intolerable. At the outset of his speech, President Sekou Touré spoke of the challenges facing the peoples of Africa.
Le ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République de Guinée a eu l'occasion de vous exprimer.
The greatest evil of colonialism was to try to deprive us of our responsibilities in the conduct of our own affairs. It tried also to convince us that our civilization was nothing but savagery. It wanted to create in us certain inferiority complexes that would mark us with the seal of irresponsibility and make of us beings lacking confidence in ourselves. Therefore, the greatest of our victories will not be that we have overcome colonialism by the mere conquest of our national independence. It will be, over and above all, that we have overcome ourselves when we have finally freed ourselves of all the complexes of colonized countries, and when we, proudly and truly, express the authentic values of Africa and totally identify ourselves with them. We peoples of Africa, confident in ourselves, must always increase our awareness of our responsibilities. Thus we will realize the feelings of our effective equality with other peoples. We know we have to rebuild Africa, to conquer and proclaim the independence of a country and then maintain its ancient political structures would be to plow a field but not to sow it and then to expect a harvest.
And during this same week, the perennial and all-pervading issue of disarmament came back to the United Nations. In the main political committee of the General Assembly, Arthur Lal of India was the first speaker. He wanted action by the United States and the Soviet Union on the accelerating cycle of nuclear weapons tests, and he wanted them to agree to the memorandum presented by 8 non-aligned nations at Geneva. For, said Mr. Lal, survival itself is at stake.
Now, Mr. Chairman, I should like to assure this committee that the 8-nation memorandum is full of surprises for any country which embarks upon the course of violation, full of surprises, and that this element of deterrence arising out of surprise is abundantly present in the memorandum. It is sometimes said, Mr. Chairman, that more than this is necessary. What more, I would ask? Is it ever going to be possible to lead forces against either the United States or the Soviet Union to enforce a treaty? Are we going to make war on a country which doesn't observe a treaty to the hilt? Surely that is not the case. Surely all that can happen is that if a treaty is broken, that the parties concerned, the parties to the treaty are free to act in any manner they please. And that also is written into the 8-nation memorandum.
Nuclear testing, colonialism, Cuba, admission of Algeria to the United Nations. Unrelated issues? Perhaps. But matters of concern to the whole world. For in this age, no human problem can be isolated from the world at large. This is Don Pringle at the United Nations. This is National Educational Television.